My name is Tommy Vega, and I'm a cart driver who survived the first 127 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted, civilization collapsed within weeks. Temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees. My horses and mules became the only reliable transportation left. I watched neighbors freeze to death while fighting to keep my animals alive. Every day meant choosing between helping others or saving myself. This is how I survived when the world turned into a frozen wasteland. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I'm sitting here in what used to be my neighbor's living room in Greeley, Colorado, and it's day 127 since Yellowstone erupted. The thermometer outside reads -38 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's actually warmer than yesterday. I can hear the wind howling through the boarded-up windows, and somewhere in the distance, there's that sound again. Could be wolves, could be another survivor calling for help that won't come. Hard to tell the difference anymore. My name is Tommy Vega, and I used to make a living hauling equipment and supplies to the mining operations up in the Colorado Rockies with my horse and mule team. 6 draft horses and 4 mules, each one trained for different types of work. Heavy hauling, navigating rough terrain, dealing with weather that would stop most vehicles cold. I never thought those skills would be what kept me alive when the world ended, but here we are. Before I tell you how I survived these past 4 months, you need to understand what my life was like before that Tuesday morning in September when everything changed. I lived about 15 miles outside Greeley on a property my grandfather bought back in the 1960s. 40 acres of pasture and hay fields, with a solid barn that could house all my animals and equipment. The barn was built right, thick walls, and a metal roof that could handle Colorado weather. That barn saved my life more times than I can count. My daily routine started before sunrise every morning. First thing was always checking on the animals. Horses need consistency, and mules are smart enough to know when something's wrong before you do. I'd feed them, check their hooves, make sure their water wasn't frozen. Even in normal Colorado winters, you had to break ice on the water troughs most mornings from November through March. After the animals were sorted, I'd load up whatever needed hauling that day. Mining equipment mostly, but sometimes supplies for the Forest Service or gear for hunting guides working the high country. The work was physical and demanding, but it paid well. There aren't many people left who know how to handle a 6-horse team on mountain trails, and even fewer who can do it safely when you're hauling 1,000 pounds of drilling equipment up a trail that would make most people dizzy just looking at it. The mining companies paid premium rates because my animals could get to places their trucks couldn't reach, especially during bad weather or when the roads washed out from spring runoff. I had regular customers who'd been using my services for years. Henderson Mine was my biggest client, followed by a couple smaller operations further up in the mountains. These weren't huge corporate mines, just small outfits pulling gold and silver out of claims that had been worked on and off for over a century. The kind of places where modern equipment was too expensive to justify, but a man with a good team of animals could still make it profitable. The animals weren't just livestock to me. Each one had their own personality, their own strengths and weaknesses. Cisco was my lead horse, a big bay gelding who could read terrain better than most people. He'd been with me for 8 years, and I trusted him to pick the safest path up any mountain trail. Belle was my steadiest mare, the one I'd put in the team when I needed reliability over speed. The mules had names too: Buster, Pepper, Jake, and Ruby. Mules are smarter than horses, more cautious, but also more stubborn. You can't force a mule to do something dangerous, which makes them perfect for mountain work where one wrong step could kill you. I lived alone on the property, never married, though I came close once back in my 20s. Sarah Chen was her name, and she worked as a veterinarian in Fort Collins. We dated for 3 years, and I thought we might make it permanent, but she couldn't handle the isolation and the unpredictable schedule that came with my work. Can't say I blame her. The work took me away for days at a time, and when you're dealing with animals, you can't just clock out at 5 o'clock when something goes wrong. That Tuesday morning started like any other, September 15th, and the weather was still warm enough that I didn't need more than a light jacket when I went out to feed the animals at 5:30 in the morning. The horses were acting strange, though. Cisco wouldn't come to the fence when I called, which wasn't like him at all. He was always the first one looking for breakfast. Belle was pacing in the far corner of the pasture, and the mules were bunched together near the barn, which they never did unless there was a storm coming. I checked the weather on my phone while I was filling water troughs. Clear skies predicted for the whole week, no storms in the forecast. But animals know things we don't, and after 15 years of working with horses and mules, I'd learned to pay attention when they were trying to tell me something. I decided to keep them in the barn that day instead of turning them out to pasture after breakfast. The first emergency alert came through on my phone at 7:42 in the morning. Geological emergency in Yellowstone National Park. Avoid the area. More information to follow. I was in the kitchen making coffee when it buzzed, and I almost didn't check it. Emergency alerts went out for everything these days, from flash floods to missing kids to severe thunderstorm warnings. But something made me look at this one, maybe because the animals had been acting so strange. 20 minutes later, my phone was buzzing every few minutes with new alerts. Major geological event, National Guard being mobilized. Avoid travel to Wyoming and southern Montana. I turned on the television and found every news channel showing the same helicopter footage. A massive column of ash and smoke rising from what used to be Yellowstone Lake, so tall it disappeared into the clouds. The reporter was calling it a supervolcanic eruption, the kind that only happens every few 100,000 years. I'd read about supervolcanoes before. Every couple years, some documentary would run about what would happen if Yellowstone erupted, how it would affect the climate, how much ash would get thrown into the atmosphere. But watching it actually happen on live television was different than reading about it in some magazine article. The ash column was already spreading east, carried by the jet stream winds. The reporter said it would reach Colorado by that evening. My first instinct was to secure everything I could. I drove into Greeley and bought every bag of horse feed Murdoch's had in stock. The clerk thought I was crazy, loading 2 tons of sweet feed and hay pellets into my truck, but I figured it was better to have too much than not enough. I also bought tarps, rope, extra water containers, and a hand pump for the well in case the power went out. The store was busier than usual, but people were buying normal emergency supplies. Flashlights, batteries, canned food. Nobody else was thinking about how to feed livestock if supply trucks stopped running. I stopped at the feed store on my way home and bought another ton of hay. The old man who ran the place, Ed Kowalski, helped me load it into my trailer. He'd been selling feed to ranchers and horse people for 40 years, and he had this look on his face I'd never seen before. When we finished loading, he leaned against my truck and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Tommy, this ain't natural snow that's coming. You keep those animals close, and you keep yourself ready for a winter that might not end." At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Ed was in his 70s, and old-timers have a tendency to predict disaster every time the weather gets a little unusual. But looking back now, I think he understood what was coming better than any of the experts on television. He'd lived through enough hard winters to recognize the signs when nature was about to show us who was really in charge. I spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the barn and checking my equipment. The building was solid, but I wanted to make sure it could handle whatever was coming. I cleared space to store more feed, organized my tools, and double-checked the generator I used during power outages. The horses were still acting nervous, but they settled down once I brought them inside and gave them extra hay. The ash started falling around 6 o'clock that evening. At first, it looked like snow, but grayer and finer. It didn't stick to the ground the way snow does, just collected in drifts against buildings and fence posts. The smell was wrong too. Snow smells clean and cold. This ash smelled like sulfur and burnt rock, and it made your throat burn if you breathed too much of it. By the next morning, there was about an inch of ash covering everything. My truck looked like it had been parked next to a coal plant for a month. The ash was so fine it got into everything. When I went out to feed the animals, I had to wear a bandana over my face to keep from coughing. The horses didn't want to go outside, and I couldn't blame them. Walking through the ash was like walking through talcum powder that got stirred up with every step. The television news was calling it a temporary situation. The ash would settle out of the atmosphere in a few weeks, they said. Temperatures might drop slightly due to reduced sunlight, but nothing that would cause major problems. The government was setting up emergency shelters in affected areas and working to restore transportation networks as quickly as possible. I knew they were wrong, not because I'm smarter than meteorologists or geologists, but because I could see what was happening to the animals. The horses wouldn't drink water that had ash in it, even after I filtered it. The local birds had disappeared completely. Squirrels, rabbits, deer, all the wildlife that normally lived around my property was gone. Animals don't stick around when they sense danger, and they'd all decided this wasn't a place to be anymore. The first week, people in town were treating the ash fall like a novelty. Schools closed for a few days, but that was normal for any kind of emergency. People were posting pictures on social media of their cars and houses covered in gray ash, making jokes about volcanic snow days. The grocery stores were busy, but not panicked busy. Just the normal rush you get when people think they might be stuck at home for a weekend. I spent that week preparing like it was going to be permanent. I hauled water from the well to fill every container I owned. I moved all my feed into the barn where it would stay dry. I checked and double-checked my tools, my generator, my heating system. Most importantly, I started rationing. Even though I had more feed than I'd ever stored before, I calculated how long it would last if supply trucks couldn't get through for months instead of weeks. Mrs. Patterson, who lived about a mile down the road from me, stopped by on day 5 to check on how I was handling things. She was in her 70s, lived alone since her husband died, and had a small herd of cattle she'd been raising for decades. She looked worried in a way I'd never seen before. Her cattle were refusing to graze, she said. They'd stand at the fence line looking toward her barn, but they wouldn't go out into the pasture where the ash had collected on the grass. I walked over to her place that afternoon to take a look. Her cattle were healthy animals, used to grazing on rough mountain pasture, but they were acting like the grass was poisonous. They'd take a few steps into the field, sniff the ash-covered grass, then retreat back to the fence. Cattle aren't smart animals, but they have good instincts about what's safe to eat. If they wouldn't touch grass with ash on it, there was probably a good reason. That's when I started to understand that this wasn't going to be a temporary inconvenience. The ash wasn't just blocking sunlight and making things dirty. It was changing the entire environment in ways that would take months or years to fully understand. Plants weren't going to grow normally. Animals weren't going to graze normally. And if animals couldn't eat, people were going to have problems too. By the end of the first week, the ash was 3 inches deep and still falling. The sun was barely visible through the ash clouds, just a dim orange disk that gave off almost no warmth. Temperatures were dropping faster than they should for September in Colorado. Instead of the normal 70-degree days we usually got that time of year, it was struggling to reach 50 degrees by midday. The power started flickering on day 8, not going out completely, just intermittent outages that would last for a few hours at a time. The utility company said it was due to ash buildup on power lines and transformers, and they were working to clear it as quickly as possible. But I could tell from the way the outages were spreading that they were fighting a losing battle. The ash was falling faster than they could clean it off. I started running my generator every day to make sure it was working properly. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck without power in the middle of winter, with 10 animals depending on me for food and water. I also started melting snow and ash to top off my water storage, filtering it through cloth to get out the worst of the particles. The water from the well was still clean, but I didn't know how long that would last if the ash kept falling. My regular customers started calling to cancel jobs. Henderson Mines shut down operations when their access road became impassable due to ash drifts. The other mining outfits followed suit within a few days. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't have any work scheduled. Under normal circumstances, that would have been a financial disaster. But something told me that money wasn't going to be the biggest problem we'd be facing. The grocery stores in Greeley started having supply problems on day 10. Not empty shelves yet, but gaps where certain items used to be. Bread, milk, fresh produce, anything that required regular delivery trucks. The main highways were still passable, but it was taking twice as long for trucks to make their runs, and some drivers were refusing to enter the ash zone at all. I made one last trip to town on day 12 to buy whatever supplies I could find. The mood was different than it had been the week before. People weren't joking about volcanic snow anymore. There were long lines at the gas stations, and the hardware store was cleaned out of heating supplies, batteries, and generators. I managed to buy some canned food and medical supplies, but most of what I really needed was already gone. On the drive home, I passed 3 cars broken down on the side of the road. The ash was getting into engines and clogging air filters faster than people could replace them. My truck was having problems too, but I'd been changing the air filter every day and keeping the engine compartment as clean as possible. Even so, I could tell it wasn't going to last much longer if the ash kept falling at this rate. That night, I made the decision to stop driving unless it was absolutely necessary. The truck was my backup plan for getting myself and the animals out if things got really bad, and I couldn't afford to have it break down from ash damage. From that point forward, if I needed to go anywhere, I'd use the horse-drawn sled I normally reserved for winter work in the mountains. Day 15 brought the first real temperature drop. Instead of the gradual cooling we'd been experiencing, it dropped 20 degrees overnight. I woke up to find ice on the water troughs for the first time, and it was only the second week of October. In Colorado, we usually didn't see freezing temperatures until late November at the earliest. The horses were starting to eat more than usual, burning extra calories to stay warm. I increased their rations, but I was already calculating how long my feed supply would last at the new consumption rate. Even with all the extra feed I'd bought, I had maybe 4 months if the ash kept falling and the temperatures kept dropping. Mrs. Patterson called that morning to tell me her power had gone out completely. The utility company told her it might be several days before they could restore service to her area. I hitched up my sled and took her some firewood and food, plus a spare propane heater I had in storage. Her cattle were in bad shape, standing in the barn refusing to go outside even for water. She was having to carry buckets to them multiple times a day. On the way back from her place, I saw my first dead wildlife. A deer lying at the edge of the road, not hit by a car or killed by predators. Just dead, with ash caked around its nose and mouth. I'd heard that volcanic ash could cause respiratory problems in animals, but seeing it firsthand was different than reading about it in some emergency preparedness manual. The television news was still optimistic at that point, but you could tell the reporters were starting to worry. They kept using phrases like temporary disruption and full recovery expected, but they were also starting to talk about emergency shelters and federal disaster assistance. More importantly, they were starting to admit that they didn't really know how long the ash fall would continue or how severe the climate effects would be. I stopped watching the news after day 18. It was clear that nobody really understood what was happening, and listening to speculation wasn't helping me prepare for what was coming. Instead, I focused on getting my animals and property ready for what was starting to look like the worst winter in recorded history. The ash was 6 inches deep by day 20, and it was getting harder to move around outside. Walking through, it was like walking through sand, except it got stirred up into clouds that made you cough and burned your eyes. I started wearing safety goggles and a respirator whenever I had to do work outside, and I kept the animals in the barn all the time except when I needed to move them to the pasture for exercise. Food deliveries to the grocery store stopped completely on day 22. The manager at the Safeway in Greeley told anyone who would listen that their distribution center in Denver was shut down due to ash accumulation, and they didn't know when service would resume. People started hoarding whatever food was left on the shelves, and there were reports of fights breaking out in some stores. I went into town one last time on day 23, using my horse-drawn sled because the truck was too risky. The roads were barely passable, with ash drifts across the pavement that were deep enough to trap smaller vehicles. Most of the businesses were closed, either because their employees couldn't get to work or because they didn't have any products to sell. The few people I saw looked scared in a way I'd never seen before. This wasn't the kind of fear you get from a thunderstorm or even a blizzard. This was the deep, primal fear that comes when you realize the systems you depend on for survival aren't working anymore, and nobody knows how to fix them. I bought the last case of motor oil at the auto parts store, not because I thought my truck would be running much longer, but because oil burns well in an emergency and produces decent heat. The clerk was a young guy I'd known for years, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He told me his family was thinking about leaving Colorado, trying to get south where the ash wasn't as thick. I wished him luck, but I didn't think running was going to solve anything. From what I'd seen on the news before I stopped watching, the ash cloud covered most of the western United States. That was the last normal conversation I had with another person for a long time. By day 25, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was staying below freezing even during the day. The power grid failed completely in our area, and there was no word on when it might be restored. More importantly, I could see smoke rising from several directions, which meant people were burning whatever they could find to stay warm. The sound of gunshots in the distance told me that civilization was starting to break down in ways that would have been unthinkable just 3 weeks earlier. People were getting desperate, and desperate people do things they would never consider under normal circumstances. I decided it was time to secure my property and prepare for the possibility that I might have to defend my animals and supplies from people who hadn't prepared as well as I had. Standing in my barn on day 25, listening to the wind howl through the ash-filled air outside, I realized that everything I'd known about normal life was over. This wasn't a temporary emergency that would be fixed by government agencies and utility companies. This was the beginning of something entirely different, a new world where the skills I'd learned working with animals and surviving in harsh mountain conditions were going to be the difference between life and death. The horses sensed it too. They'd stopped acting nervous and started acting protective, staying close to the barn and watching the approaches to our property with an alertness I'd only seen when predators were nearby. They knew as well as I did that the easy times were over and the real test of survival was just beginning. The morning of day 26, I woke up to the sound of something I'd never heard before. Silence. Complete, absolute silence except for the wind moving ash around outside the barn. No cars on the distant highway, no airplanes overhead, no hum of electrical equipment. Just the kind of quiet you only get in the deep wilderness, except this was happening 15 miles from a city of over 100,000 people. The temperature outside was negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit. In early October, I'd lived in Colorado my entire life, and I'd never seen anything like it. The thermometer on the barn wall showed numbers that should have been impossible for the time of year, but there they were. The ash was now over a foot deep in most places, with drifts against the barn that reached almost to the windows. I spent the first hour of that morning just trying to get the barn door open. The ash had drifted against it during the night, and it took me 20 minutes of digging with a shovel to clear enough space to get outside. When I finally made it to the pasture to check the perimeter, I found tracks in the ash that hadn't been there the day before. Large paw prints, probably wolves, circling the property like they were scouting for weaknesses. Wolves hadn't been seen in this part of Colorado for decades, but desperate times change animal behavior just like they change human behavior. With their normal prey animals dead or driven away by the ash, predators were starting to look at domestic animals as potential food sources. My horses and mules represented a lot of meat to a hungry pack, and I was going to have to start thinking about defending them from more than just desperate humans. The horses knew something was different. When I brought them their morning feed, they were more alert than usual, ears constantly moving, heads turning toward every sound. Cisco, my lead horse, positioned himself between the barn door and the other animals, something he'd only done before when mountain lions were in the area. Animals have instincts that humans have mostly forgotten, and they were telling him that predators were nearby. I checked my ammunition supply that morning for the first time since this whole situation started. I had a 30-06 rifle for hunting, a 12-gauge shotgun for protection, and a 9mm pistol that had belonged to my father. Plenty of ammunition for normal circumstances, but I was starting to realize that these weren't going to be normal circumstances for a very long time. Mrs. Patterson didn't answer when I called her that morning. Her phone went straight to voicemail, which could have meant the cell towers were down, or her phone battery was dead, or something worse. I decided to check on her after I finished the morning chores, but first I needed to secure water for the animals. The well was still producing, but I had to run the hand pump for almost an hour to fill all the troughs because the electric pump wasn't working without power. The trip to Mrs. Patterson's place took twice as long as usual because the ash was so deep. My sled moved through it but slowly, and the horses had to work harder than they should have. I could see smoke rising from her chimney, which was a good sign, but when I got close to her house, I noticed that her cattle weren't in their usual spots near the barn. She answered the door when I knocked, but she looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past week. Her face was gaunt, and she moved like someone who hadn't been eating enough. She invited me in, and I could see immediately that she was in trouble. The house was cold despite the fire in the fireplace, and when I looked in her refrigerator, it was nearly empty. Her cattle were dying. She'd lost 2 in the past 3 days, and the rest were refusing to eat anything. Even the hay she'd stored in her barn, they wouldn't touch it if there was any ash contamination. She'd been trying to feed them by hand, carrying clean hay from the very center of her storage area, but it wasn't enough. A 1,000-pound cow needs about 30 pounds of feed per day, and she had 12 cattle left. I helped her drag the dead cattle away from the barn. We couldn't bury them because the ground was frozen solid, so we had to pull them into the pasture where they wouldn't contaminate the area around her buildings. It was hard work in the deep ash, and both of us were exhausted by the time we finished. That's when she said something that stayed with me ever since. She looked at those dead cattle and said, "Tommy, I think this might be permanent. I think we might have to learn to live in a different world than the one we grew up in." Then she asked me if I thought her remaining cattle had any chance of surviving the winter. I told her the truth. Without clean feed and protection from the cold, they probably had a few weeks at most. The decision she made that day was one of the hardest things I've ever watched another person go through. She asked me if I could put her cattle down humanely and help her preserve the meat before it spoiled. She knew she couldn't keep them alive, and she knew that if she waited until they died naturally, the meat would be worthless. It was the kind of practical, hard choice that people didn't have to make in the modern world, but the modern world was gone. I spent the rest of that day helping her butcher 12 head of cattle. We worked in her barn, using the cold temperatures to our advantage to keep the meat from spoiling. It was brutal work, both physically and emotionally, but it was also necessary. Those cattle represented months of protein for her, and possibly for other people in the area who were running out of food. By the time we finished, it was getting dark, and I didn't want to try to navigate back to my place with the sled in complete darkness. Mrs. Patterson offered to let me stay the night, and I accepted. We cooked steaks over her fireplace and talked about what we thought was going to happen next. Neither of us was optimistic. She told me that she'd talked to her nephew in Denver the day before the phones went completely dead. The city was in chaos, she said. Food riots, power outages, and people freezing to death in their homes because the natural gas supply had been disrupted by ash buildup in the distribution system. The government was talking about evacuating the entire Front Range, but there was nowhere to evacuate to. The ash cloud covered everything from the Pacific coast to the Mississippi River. That night, lying in Mrs. Patterson's guest room, I heard sounds outside that confirmed my worst fears about the wildlife situation. Howling, but not just one or two animals. A whole pack, and they were close. Close enough that I could hear them moving around the property, testing fences, looking for ways to get to the meat we'd spent the day processing. I got up and looked out the window. In the dim light reflected off the ash, I could see shapes moving around the barn. Large shapes, definitely wolves, but more of them than should have been in a single pack. Desperation was driving them to behavior that wasn't normal for their species, just like it was driving humans to do things they never would have considered before. Mrs. Patterson was awake too. She came into the room carrying her husband's old hunting rifle and stood next to me at the window. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was thinking the same thing I was. If wolves were getting this bold around humans, it was only a matter of time before they started actively hunting people, especially people who were weak from hunger or cold, or people who were alone and vulnerable. The next morning, day 28, I helped Mrs. Patterson load as much of the processed beef as she could carry into her pickup truck. She'd made the decision to try to reach her sister's house in Kansas, where the ash wasn't as thick and the temperatures were more survivable. I thought it was a mistake to leave, but I understood why she felt like she had to try. Before I left her place, she gave me a quarter of the beef we'd processed. She said it was payment for helping her, but I knew it was really because she was worried about me trying to survive the winter alone. She also gave me a key to her house and told me I was welcome to anything I could use if she didn't make it back. We both knew she probably wouldn't be coming back. The trip home took 3 hours because of the ash depth and the fact that I was pulling a heavy load of meat. I had to stop frequently to rest the horses, and by the time I reached my property, they were exhausted. The temperature was dropping again, and I could see more storm clouds building to the west. Not normal storm clouds, but the weird, ash-filled formations that had been producing the mixture of snow and volcanic debris that was making travel almost impossible. I spent the afternoon of day 28 organizing the meat Mrs. Patterson had given me and figuring out how to preserve it without refrigeration. The cold temperatures were helping, but I needed a better long-term solution. I decided to build a smokehouse using materials from an old shed that was already falling down. Smoking meat was something my grandfather had taught me when I was a kid, and it was going to be essential for making protein last through what was looking like a very long winter. That evening, I heard vehicles moving on the road near my property. Not normal traffic, but slow-moving vehicles with engines that sounded like they were struggling. I looked out through the barn window and saw a convoy of pickup trucks and SUVs loaded down with people and supplies. Refugees heading south like Mrs. Patterson, trying to get away from the worst of the ash fall. I almost went out to talk to them, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way they were driving, fast and desperate, or maybe it was the fact that I could see weapons visible in some of the vehicles. These weren't families on a planned evacuation. These were people who were running from something, and they looked like they might be willing to take whatever they needed from anyone who got in their way. The convoy passed without stopping, but it left me thinking about security in a way I hadn't before. Up until that point, I'd been focused on surviving the cold and keeping my animals fed. But if desperate people were moving through the area in organized groups, I was going to have to start thinking about defending my property from human threats as well as natural ones. Day 30 brought the first real test of my preparations. I woke up to find that the temperature had dropped to negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and the wind was howling so hard that it was creating ash storms that reduced visibility to almost zero. When I tried to get to the barn to feed the animals, I could barely find my way across the yard. The horses were clustered together in the center of the barn, sharing body heat and staying as far away from the walls as possible. Even inside the building, the cold was brutal. I'd never experienced anything like it in Colorado, not even during the worst mountain storms I'd worked through over the years. This was the kind of cold that killed people who weren't prepared for it. I spent most of that day inside the barn with the animals, keeping the small wood stove burning and trying to stay warm. The wood I'd cut and stored over the summer was going to run out much faster than I'd planned if the temperatures stayed this low. I started breaking up wooden pallets and old fence posts to burn, calculating how long my fuel supply would last if the cold continued. That's when I heard the first gunshots in the distance. Not hunting shots, which have a different rhythm and spacing. These were rapid fire, multiple weapons, the kind of shooting that happens when people are fighting each other. The sound carried clearly through the cold air, and it was coming from the direction of town. Greeley was 15 miles away, but sound travels differently in extreme cold, and I could hear what sounded like a war zone. The shooting continued intermittently throughout the day. Sometimes single shots, sometimes bursts of automatic weapons fire. By evening, I could see fires burning in the direction of the city, orange glows against the ash-filled sky that suggested large buildings were burning. Without fire departments able to respond quickly due to the road conditions, fires would spread unchecked until they burned themselves out. I made a decision that night that probably saved my life. I moved my sleeping bag into the barn with the animals and started sleeping there instead of in the house. The barn was easier to heat with the wood stove. The animals provided additional warmth, and if anyone tried to approach my property, the horses would alert me long before I'd hear them from inside the house. Day 32 was when I saw my first refugees on foot. A family with two small children, walking along the road in front of my property, pulling a sled loaded with whatever belongings they could carry. They were moving slowly, and I could tell from their body language that they were exhausted and probably hadn't eaten in days. I watched them for almost an hour, trying to decide whether to approach them or stay hidden. Part of me wanted to help, especially because of the children, but another part of me knew that helping one family would mean word would spread that I had food and supplies. In a situation where most people were desperate, that kind of information could get me killed. In the end, I waited until they were past my property, then followed them at a distance with my sled. About 2 miles down the road, they stopped at an abandoned farmhouse and tried to break in to get out of the cold. The building wasn't secure, and they managed to get inside, but I could see that it didn't have heat or electricity. They weren't going to survive the night in those temperatures without a heat source. I left a bundle of firewood and some dried meat where they would find it, then retreated back to my property without making contact. It wasn't much, but it might have been enough to keep them alive until they could reach wherever they were trying to go. I never found out if they made it or not, but I think about those children sometimes and hope they survived. The pattern continued for the next several days. More refugees passing by, some in vehicles but most on foot, all heading south. Some of them stopped and looked at my property, obviously considering whether to approach for help or try to take what I had by force. The visible smoke from my chimney made it clear that someone was living there, but the deep ash around the buildings and the lack of obvious vehicle tracks probably made it look like the place might be abandoned. Day 35 brought my first direct confrontation with other survivors. I was in the barn feeding the animals when I heard voices outside. Not normal conversation, but the kind of low, planning voices that people use when they're discussing something they don't want overheard. I looked through a crack in the barn wall and saw three men with rifles examining my property. They weren't refugees. These were healthy-looking men with good equipment and vehicles that were still running. They looked like they'd been eating regularly and staying warm, which meant they had a secure base of operations somewhere. They also moved like people who were used to taking what they wanted, and they were obviously discussing the best way to approach my barn. I had maybe 30 seconds to decide how to handle the situation. I could try to hide and hope they would leave, but if they decided to search the buildings, they'd find me eventually. I could try to negotiate, but three armed men against one didn't offer good odds if the negotiation went bad. Or I could take the initiative and confront them before they got organized. I chose confrontation. I stepped out of the barn with my shotgun in my hands and announced myself before they could spread out or find cover. I told them this was private property and they needed to move along. The conversation that followed was tense but brief. They claimed they were just looking for a place to get warm, but their body language suggested they had other intentions. The leader of the group was a man in his 40s with military bearing and equipment that looked like it might have been stolen from a National Guard armory. He tested me by asking specific questions about what supplies I had and whether I was alone. I answered honestly that I was armed and prepared to defend my property, and I made it clear that I'd already seen them approach and would see them coming if they tried to return. What convinced them to leave wasn't my threats or my shotgun. It was when Cisco whinnied from inside the barn, and they realized I had horses. Horses meant mobility, which meant I could disappear into the mountains where their vehicles couldn't follow. It also meant I probably had other resources they hadn't considered. They decided I wasn't worth the risk and moved on, but not before the leader told me they'd be back if things got worse. That encounter changed everything about how I approached security. Up until that point, I'd been focused on hiding and avoiding contact with other people. But now, I realized that other people knew I was there, and some of them were organized enough to pose a serious threat. I was going to have to start thinking like someone who might have to fight for his survival. I spent the next 2 days setting up early warning systems around my property. Nothing fancy, just tripwires connected to cans filled with rocks that would make noise if anyone tried to approach the barn at night. I also cleared lines of sight from the barn to the most likely approach routes and made sure I had ammunition readily available. More importantly, I started varying my routine so that anyone watching my property wouldn't be able to predict when I'd be vulnerable. Instead of feeding the animals at the same time every morning, I changed the schedule randomly. Instead of always using the same door to enter and leave the barn, I started using different routes. Small changes, but they might make the difference if someone was planning to ambush me. Day 40 brought new challenges from an unexpected direction. The horses were starting to show signs of stress that went beyond just the cold and the limited feed. They were losing weight despite getting their normal rations, and their coats weren't growing in as thick as they should have for winter. I realized they were suffering from the same kind of respiratory problems that had killed the deer I'd found weeks earlier. The volcanic ash was so fine that it was getting into their lungs despite my efforts to keep them inside the barn. Every time they went outside for exercise, or when I needed to move them, they were breathing in particles that were causing inflammation and making it harder for them to process oxygen efficiently. I started limiting their outside time even more, but I knew that lack of exercise was going to cause other health problems. Belle, my steadiest mare, was showing the worst symptoms. She developed a cough that got worse every day, and she was reluctant to eat even her favorite foods. I tried everything I could think of, from steam treatments to different types of feed, but nothing seemed to help. The ash was winning, and I was starting to realize that even my best efforts might not be enough to keep all the animals alive. The human situation was deteriorating just as fast as the animal situation. The gunfire from the direction of town had become a constant background noise, and the fires were getting larger and more frequent. When the wind was right, I could smell smoke that wasn't just from burning buildings. It was the sweet, sick smell of organic matter burning, and I tried not to think too hard about what that might include. By day 45, the refugees passing by my property had changed character. Instead of families with children trying to reach safer areas, I was seeing more single men and small groups of people who looked like they were running from something specific, rather than just fleeing the general disaster. These people moved faster, looked over their shoulders more often, and carried weapons openly. Some of them were injured. I saw people with bandages, people limping, people who looked like they'd been in fights recently. The civilized evacuation that had started in the first weeks after the eruption was turning into something more like a retreat from a war zone, with all the violence and desperation that implied. Day 48 brought the most serious challenge yet. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of vehicles approaching my property, not passing by like the others, but actually turning into my driveway and stopping near the house. I could hear doors slamming and voices, at least 4 or 5 people, maybe more. I grabbed my rifle and moved to a position in the barn where I could see the house without being visible from outside. The vehicles were pickup trucks with camper shells, and the people getting out of them had the organized look of a military unit. Not actual military, probably, but people who were used to working together and taking what they needed by force. They didn't try to be subtle. They went straight to the house and kicked in the front door, obviously expecting to find me sleeping inside. When they discovered the house was empty, they started a systematic search of the other buildings. I had maybe 5 minutes before they reached the barn, and I had to decide whether to fight or try to escape. Fighting 5 or 6 armed people from inside a wooden building wasn't a good option. Even if I got some of them, the others would eventually overwhelm me, and then they'd have everything I'd worked to preserve. Escaping meant abandoning the animals and most of my supplies, but it also meant staying alive to potentially recover things later. I made the hardest decision of my life up to that point. I slipped out the back of the barn and made my way to the pasture, where I'd left my emergency sled loaded with basic survival supplies. The horses were agitated by the noise and activity, but I couldn't take them without making sounds that would give away my location. I had to leave them behind and hope the raiders would see them as valuable enough to keep alive. From a position in the trees about a quarter-mile from the barn, I watched the raiders search my property. They found the animals, the feed supplies, the preserved meat, and everything else I'd accumulated over the past month and a half. They loaded what they could carry into their trucks and discussed what to do with the rest. The conversation I overheard made it clear that they'd been systematically raiding properties throughout the area, taking whatever they needed and leaving nothing for the original owners. They spent about 2 hours at my place, then loaded up and drove away. But they left 2 men behind, hidden in positions where they could watch the property. They were expecting me to come back, and they were prepared to ambush me when I did. It was a professional operation, and it told me that the breakdown of civilization was creating organizations that were a lot more dangerous than individual desperate people. I spent the next 3 days living in the forest, watching my property from a distance and trying to figure out how to get my animals back. The 2 men the raiders had left behind were disciplined and alert, changing positions regularly and maintaining constant watch on all the approaches to the barn. They obviously had military or law enforcement training, and they weren't going to be easy to outmaneuver. On day 51, the decision was made for me. I watched from my hiding place as Belle collapsed in the pasture and didn't get up. Her respiratory problems had gotten worse while I was away, and without proper care, she'd finally succumbed to the ash poisoning that was affecting all the animals in the area. The 2 guards didn't even bother to check on her. They just let her die where she fell. That's when I realized that getting my animals back might not be possible, and even if it was, they might not survive much longer anyway. The ash was killing everything, slowly but inevitably, and all I could do was try to stay alive long enough to see if the situation would ever improve. The world I'd known was gone, and the new world was going to require different skills and different priorities than anything I'd learned before. The 3 days I spent hiding in the forest watching those guards at my property taught me something important about the new world we were living in. Patience wasn't just a virtue anymore, it was a survival skill. The men the raiders had left behind were good at what they did, but they weren't prepared for someone who could wait them out. On the morning of day 52, they finally made a mistake. I'd been living off the emergency supplies I'd packed in my sled, rationing everything to make it last as long as possible. Cold jerky, melted snow for water, and a few hours of sleep at a time while staying alert for any changes in the guard pattern. It was miserable, but it was keeping me alive, and more importantly, it was teaching me how much I could endure when I had to. The guards had been rotating shifts every 12 hours, with one man sleeping in the barn while the other kept watch. But on day 52, something disrupted their routine. I heard gunfire from the direction of town around dawn, more intense than usual, and both guards became agitated. They spent the morning talking on radio equipment, and by afternoon, one of them was packing up to leave. The conversation I overheard from my position in the trees made it clear that their main group was under attack somewhere else and needed reinforcements. The remaining guard was told to maintain watch on my property for another 24 hours, then abandon the position if no one showed up. It was the opportunity I'd been waiting for, but it also meant that the situation in the wider area was getting more desperate. After the first guard left, I spent 6 hours observing the remaining man's patterns. He was tired from pulling double shifts, and he was obviously nervous about being alone. More importantly, he'd positioned himself in the barn where he could stay warm, which meant he couldn't see all the approaches to the property. He was focused on watching the house and the main driveway, probably expecting me to return the obvious way. I waited until after midnight, then approached the barn from the side that faced away from the house. The surviving animals were clustered in the far corner, and I could hear them moving restlessly in their stalls. Cisco was still alive, along with 3 of the mules and 2 other horses. Belle's body was still lying in the pasture where she died, already partially frozen and covered with ash. The guard had made himself comfortable in my workshop area of the barn, using my own wood stove to stay warm and eating supplies from my own stores. He had his rifle leaning against the wall within easy reach, but he was more focused on the radio than on watching for threats. The constant chatter from his group was telling him about a running battle with what sounded like another organized raider group, and he was worried about his own people. I could have killed him. I had a clear shot from outside the barn, and he'd never have known what hit him. But something held me back. Maybe it was the knowledge that he was just trying to survive like everyone else, or maybe it was the understanding that once I crossed that line, there would be no going back to being the person I'd been before all this started. Instead, I decided to wait him out. If his orders were to abandon the position after 24 hours, I could reclaim my property without bloodshed. But the animals couldn't wait that long. I could see from their condition that they were suffering from dehydration and stress, and the remaining feed was running low. If I waited too long, I might get my property back only to find my animals dead. The decision was made for me around 3 in the morning when the guard's radio crackled with an urgent message. His group was retreating from whatever battle they'd been fighting, and all personnel were ordered to fall back to a rally point 20 miles south. The guard didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gear, loaded what supplies he could carry quickly, and drove away within 15 minutes of receiving the order. I waited another hour to make sure he wasn't coming back, then approached the barn cautiously. The animals recognized me immediately, and their relief was obvious. They crowded around me looking for food and water, and I could see that they'd lost significant weight during the time I'd been away. Cisco in particular looked gaunt, and his eyes had the dull look that horses get when they're suffering from malnutrition. The raiders had taken most of my stored feed, but they'd left enough to keep the animals alive for a few more days. They'd also left the butchered beef Mrs. Patterson had given me, probably because they had enough fresh food from other raids and couldn't be bothered with carrying smoked meat. It wasn't much, but it was something to build on. I spent the rest of that night taking inventory of what was left and planning how to stretch the remaining supplies. The raiders had taken my truck, my tools, most of my preserved food, and anything else that was easily portable. But they'd left the heavy equipment, the animals, and the basic infrastructure of the barn. I could work with what remained, but I was going to have to be more careful than ever about conservation. Day 53 brought new challenges I hadn't anticipated. The stress of the past few days had triggered something in the remaining animals that I'd read about but never seen firsthand. They were starting to turn aggressive toward each other, competing for food and water in ways they never had before. Cisco bit one of the mules during feeding time, and two of the horses got into a kicking fight over access to the water trough. This wasn't normal horse behavior. These animals had lived together peacefully for years, but the combination of poor nutrition, constant stress, and overcrowding in the barn was pushing them beyond their normal social limits. I realized I was going to have to separate them or risk having them injure each other, but I didn't have enough space or resources to house them individually. The solution I came up with wasn't perfect, but it worked. I started feeding them in shifts, bringing only 2 animals into the main barn area at a time while keeping the others in makeshift stalls I'd created using salvaged materials. It meant more work for me, but it reduced the competition and stress that was causing the aggressive behavior. More importantly, I started rationing their feed more strictly than I ever had before. Instead of giving them what they needed to maintain their weight, I gave them just enough to keep them alive. It was heartbreaking to watch them lose condition, but it was the only way to make the remaining feed last until I could find more sources. The weather was getting worse every day. Temperatures that had been hovering around -20 degrees Fahrenheit were now dropping to -30 on a regular basis. The ash storms were becoming more frequent and more intense, creating whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. I'd lived through Colorado blizzards before, but these ash storms were different. They lasted longer, covered larger areas, and created a fine dust that got into everything despite my best efforts to seal the barn. Day 57 brought my first real close call with the wildlife situation I'd been worried about since the beginning. I was outside breaking ice on the water trough when I heard growling from the direction of the pasture. Not dog growling, but the deep, threatening sound that large predators make when they're asserting dominance over territory or prey. I looked up to see a pack of 6 wolves standing about 50 yards from the barn. They weren't the normal wolves that occasionally wandered down from the mountains. These were thin, desperate animals with the kind of aggressive posture that meant they were past the point of being afraid of humans. They were looking at the barn, at me, and at the animals inside with the calculating gaze of predators evaluating potential prey. The horses sensed them immediately. I could hear them moving restlessly in their stalls, and Cisco was making the low, whickering sound he used when he was nervous about predators. The wolves could smell the animals, and they knew there was food inside the barn. The only question was whether they thought they could get past me to reach it. I backed slowly toward the barn door, keeping my eyes on the wolves but not making direct eye contact, which they would have interpreted as a challenge. I had my rifle with me, but 6 wolves was more than I wanted to deal with in an open confrontation. If I wounded 1 or 2 without killing them, the others might become more aggressive rather than retreating. The standoff lasted about 10 minutes. The wolves tested me by moving closer, then backing off when I raised my rifle. They weren't afraid of the weapon, but they understood that I represented a threat they'd have to overcome to get to the animals. Eventually, the pack leader decided it wasn't worth the risk, and they moved off toward the forest. But I knew they'd be back. That encounter forced me to make changes I should have made weeks earlier. I started carrying my rifle everywhere, even when I was just moving between the barn and the house. I also began closing and barricading the barn door every time I went inside, something I'd never had to do before. Most importantly, I accepted that I was now living in a world where large predators saw humans as potential prey rather than something to be avoided. The wolf pack returned 3 days later, this time at night when they thought I'd be sleeping. I was awakened by the horses going crazy in their stalls, kicking and whinnying in a way that meant immediate danger. I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight and made my way to the barn door as quietly as possible. The wolves had learned from their first encounter. Instead of approaching in a group, they'd spread out around the barn and were testing different approaches. I could see their eyes reflecting in the flashlight beam as they moved through the ash drifts, trying to find a weakness in the building or a way to spook the animals into running outside where they could be brought down. This time, I didn't try to avoid confrontation. I opened the barn door and fired a shot into the air, then immediately targeted the pack leader who was closest to the building. The shot took him down, and the other wolves scattered, but not as far as I'd hoped. They retreated to the edge of the property and waited, testing whether I'd follow up with more shots or if the death of one pack member would be enough to drive them off permanently. I spent the rest of that night taking shifts between sleeping and watching for the wolves' return. They probed the perimeter several more times before dawn, but they didn't make another serious attempt to reach the barn. The death of their leader had changed the pack dynamics, and they were being more cautious about risking direct confrontation with an armed human. But I knew the wolf problem was going to get worse before it got better. As the cold continued and their normal prey animals died off or fled the area, predators were going to become increasingly desperate. My animals represented a significant food source, and eventually, hunger would overcome caution. I was going to have to be ready for more serious attacks. Day 62 brought the first sign that other people might be having similar problems with predators. I found human tracks in the ash near my property line, but they weren't normal walking tracks. These were the tracks of someone who'd been running, with long strides and deep impressions that suggested panic. The tracks led toward the forest and disappeared, but there were also paw prints following the same path. I never found out what happened to whoever made those tracks, but the implications were clear. People who were traveling alone or in small groups were becoming prey for the same predators that were threatening my animals. The wolves were learning that humans could be easier targets than horses or cattle, especially humans who were weakened by hunger and cold. This realization changed how I thought about my own security situation. Up until that point, I'd been focused on defending against human threats and protecting my animals from predators. But now I understood that I was potentially prey myself, especially if I had to leave my secure position at the barn for any reason. I started planning escape routes and backup positions, in case the barn became untenable. I identified caves in the nearby foothills that could provide shelter, and I cached supplies in several locations where I could reach them even if I had to abandon the main property quickly. Most importantly, I accepted that there might come a time when I'd have to choose between saving myself and trying to save the animals. The decision came sooner than I expected. Day 68 brought an ash storm that was worse than anything I'd experienced before. The wind was strong enough to shake the barn, and the ash was so thick that I couldn't see my hand in front of my face when I tried to look outside. The storm lasted for 18 hours, and when it finally cleared, I discovered that it had brought unwanted visitors. A group of people had taken shelter in my house during the storm. I could see smoke from the chimney and movement in the windows, but I couldn't tell how many people were there or whether they were armed. They'd obviously broken in during the worst of the weather, when the noise of the storm would have covered any sounds they made. I spent 2 hours observing the house from different positions around the barn, trying to get a count of how many people I was dealing with. I saw at least 4 different individuals, and they had supplies and equipment that suggested they weren't refugees passing through. These were people who'd chosen my property as a place to establish themselves, and they were acting like they intended to stay. The situation became clear when one of them approached the barn. He was a man in his 30s, armed with a hunting rifle, and he moved with the confidence of someone who thought he was in control of the situation. When he got close enough to talk, he announced that they were claiming the property under emergency provisions, and that I could join their group if I was willing to contribute my animals and knowledge to their common survival. It wasn't really a negotiation. He made it clear that they had superior numbers and firepower, and that they'd already established themselves in a defensive position. I could accept their offer to join as a junior member of their group, or I could leave and try to survive on my own somewhere else. The animals would stay regardless of what I decided. This was the moment I'd been dreading since the first day of the crisis. Everything I'd worked to preserve, all the preparations I'd made, all the sacrifices I'd endured, came down to a choice between submission and resistance. I could accept being absorbed into someone else's survival group and lose my independence, or I could fight for what was mine and risk losing everything, including my life. I told the man I needed time to think about his offer, and he agreed to give me until morning to decide. But I could tell from his attitude that the decision had already been made. They were taking my property whether I cooperated or not. The only question was whether I'd be allowed to stay as a subordinate member of their group, or if I'd be driven off to die in the wilderness. That night, I made preparations for what I knew would be my last stand at the property. I moved ammunition and supplies to defensive positions around the barn, and I spent time with each of the animals, knowing that I might not be able to protect them much longer. Cisco seemed to understand that something was wrong. He stayed close to me, nuzzling my shoulder in the way he did when he was trying to offer comfort. The attack came just before dawn on day 69. Not a direct assault, but a more subtle approach. They set fire to the haystack outside the barn, knowing that I'd have to come out to prevent the fire from spreading to the building where my animals were housed. It was a smart tactic that forced me to choose between staying in a defensive position and protecting the resources I needed to keep my animals alive. I chose the animals. I came out of the barn with my rifle and started fighting the fire. But as soon as I was in the open, they had me in a crossfire from positions they'd established during the night. The first shot missed me by inches, and I dove for cover behind a pile of equipment I'd left near the barn door. The firefight lasted about 20 minutes. I managed to wound at least one of them, but they had better positions and more ammunition than I did. Eventually, they worked their way close enough to the barn that continuing to resist would have meant risking the building and the animals inside. I had to make the hardest choice of my life. I surrendered, not because I was afraid to die, but because continuing to fight would have guaranteed that my animals would die along with me. I came out of my position with my hands up, hoping that joining their group would at least give me a chance to continue caring for the horses and mules that had depended on me for so long. The man who'd spoken to me the day before was their leader, and he seemed satisfied rather than angry about the resistance I'd put up. He said it showed I had the kind of spirit they needed in their group, and that my knowledge of animal husbandry would be valuable for their long-term survival plans. But he also made it clear that I was now the lowest-ranking member of their organization, and that any further resistance would result in immediate exile. I spent the next week learning the hierarchy and rules of my new situation. The group called themselves the Mountain Survivors, and they had about 12 members total, including 3 women and 2 children. They were better organized and better supplied than most of the refugee groups I'd seen, but they were also more ruthless about taking what they needed from other survivors. Their leader was named David Hawkins, and he'd been a sergeant in the army before the eruption. He ran the group with military discipline, assigning duties and responsibilities based on each member's skills and usefulness to the collective survival effort. My job was caring for the animals and using them for transportation and heavy work as needed. The animals were suffering under the new arrangement. The mountain survivors saw them primarily as resources to be exploited rather than living creatures that needed proper care. They increased the workload and decreased the feed rations, arguing that the animals needed to earn their keep by doing more work for the group. I tried to argue for better treatment, but I was told that my opinions would be considered when I'd proven my loyalty to the group. Day 75 brought the crisis I'd been expecting since joining the mountain survivors. Cisco developed a severe cough that was clearly the same respiratory condition that had killed Bell weeks earlier. The volcanic ash was finally overwhelming his system, and he was struggling to breathe even when he wasn't working. I asked Hawkins to reduce Cisco's workload and increase his feed to help him fight off the infection. Hawkins refused. He said that animals who couldn't work didn't deserve resources that could be used to keep working animals healthy. If Cisco was too sick to pull loads, then he was too sick to justify the expense of feeding him. The group's survival took priority over the health of individual animals, and I needed to accept that harsh reality if I wanted to remain part of their organization. I knew what he was really saying. If Cisco couldn't recover quickly, they were going to put him down to save resources. The horse who'd been my partner for 8 years, who'd saved my life countless times in dangerous mountain conditions, was going to be killed because he'd finally succumbed to the poison that was killing everything in this new world. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to leave the mountain survivors and take Cisco with me. If he was going to die, it would be on his own terms, not executed by people who saw him as nothing more than a resource to be managed. I might not be able to save him, but I could at least make sure he died with dignity. I spent 3 days planning my escape, waiting for the right opportunity when the guards would be distracted, and I could get Cisco out of the barn without being detected. The opportunity came on day 78 when most of the group left on a raiding expedition to a farm they'd identified about 10 miles south. Only 2 people were left to guard the property, and they were more concerned with watching for external threats than monitoring my movements. I waited until both guards were asleep, then led Cisco out of the barn as quietly as possible. He was weak and moved slowly, but he followed me willingly, seeming to understand that we were leaving the others behind. I'd packed basic supplies on a small sled, just enough to keep us alive for a few days while I found a better place to hide. We made it about 2 miles from the property before Cisco collapsed. The effort of walking through the deep ash had exhausted him, and his breathing was becoming more labored by the minute. I realized that trying to travel with him in his condition was just causing him more suffering. He was dying, and there was nothing I could do to save him. I spent his last hours sitting with him in a grove of pine trees, keeping him warm and talking to him the way I had during our years of working together. He died peacefully just before dawn on day 79, and I buried him in the frozen ground as best I could with the tools I had available. It was the end of a partnership that had defined most of my adult life, and the beginning of a new phase of survival that I'd have to face completely alone. The mountain survivors found me 2 days later. They'd followed our trail through the ash, and it wasn't hard to track a man pulling a sled through the wilderness. Hawkins was angrier than I'd ever seen him, not because I'd left, but because I'd taken an animal he considered to be group property. The fact that Cisco had died didn't matter to him. I'd stolen resources and undermined group discipline, and there had to be consequences. They stripped me of everything except the clothes I was wearing and left me in the forest with no supplies, no weapons, and no shelter. Hawkins said it was more mercy than I deserved, and that if any member of his group saw me near their territory again, they'd shoot me on sight. I was on my own in a world where being alone meant almost certain death. Standing in the forest on day 81, watching the mountain survivors disappear into the ash storm that was beginning to build on the horizon, I realized that everything I'd known about survival was going to have to change. I'd lost my animals, my property, my supplies, and my security. All I had left was the knowledge I'd gained over the past 2.5 months, and the determination to keep going even when continuing seemed impossible. The real test of my survival skills was just beginning. Standing alone in that forest on day 81 with nothing but the clothes on my back, I had to completely reimagine what survival meant. Everything I'd relied on for the past 2.5 months was gone. My animals, my barn, my stored supplies, even my basic tools had been taken by the mountain survivors. I was starting over from absolute zero in conditions that were getting worse every day. The temperature that morning was negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ash storm Hawkins and his group had disappeared into was building into something that looked like it would last for days. I had maybe 6 hours of daylight to find shelter before the full force of the storm hit, and after that, I'd need to survive entirely on my own knowledge and whatever I could scavenge from the abandoned landscape around me. The first priority was immediate shelter. I couldn't build anything substantial in the time I had, but I could create a windbreak that might keep me alive through the night. I found a fallen tree about a quarter mile from where the mountain survivors had left me, and I used broken branches and pine boughs to create a lean-to shelter on the downwind side. It wasn't much, but it would block the worst of the wind and snow. Finding materials for the shelter forced me to confront how much the landscape had changed since the eruption. Trees that should have been green and healthy were brown and dying from ash exposure. Branches that should have been flexible were brittle and broke easily. Even the pine needles, which normally stayed green through Colorado winters, were gray and falling off in large patches. The forest was dying as surely as everything else in this new world. I spent the afternoon before the storm hit gathering anything that might be useful for survival. Dead wood for fuel, pine bark that could be eaten in desperate circumstances, and stones that could be used as tools or weapons. I also looked for signs of water sources, but everything was frozen solid under layers of ash and ice. I was going to have to melt snow for drinking water, which meant maintaining a fire continuously. The hardest part of that first day alone wasn't the physical challenges of finding shelter and fuel. It was the psychological impact of complete isolation. For the past 11 weeks, even when things were at their worst, I'd had my animals for companionship. Horses and mules have personalities and intelligence that make them almost like family when you work with them every day. Without them, the silence was overwhelming. The ash storm hit just after dark, and it was worse than anything I'd experienced before. The wind was strong enough to tear branches off trees, and the ash was so thick that I couldn't see the fire I'd built just 3 feet away from my shelter. I spent the night feeding branches into the flames and trying to stay warm while ash accumulated on everything, including me. During that long night, I had time to think about what had gone wrong with the mountain survivors and what I'd learned from the experience. Hawkins and his group had made the same mistake that governments and organizations make during disasters. They'd focused on control and resource management instead of adaptation and cooperation. They'd treated people and animals as assets to be exploited rather than partners in survival. I realized that my approach had to be different if I was going to survive on my own. Instead of trying to maintain the lifestyle I'd had before the eruption, I needed to accept that the world had changed permanently and learn to live according to the new rules. That meant giving up attachments to possessions and locations and focusing on mobility and adaptability instead. The storm lasted 3 days. By the time it cleared, the ash was over 18 inches deep in most places, with drifts that reached 4 feet against any obstruction. Moving through, it was like walking through quicksand that also happened to be freezing cold and toxic to breathe. I quickly understood why most of the refugees I'd seen had been following roads rather than trying to travel cross-country. My shelter had survived the storm, but just barely. The lean-to had collapsed twice during the worst winds, and I'd had to rebuild it both times while the ash was still falling. The fire had been even more challenging to maintain. The ash smothered flames if you weren't constantly clearing it away, and finding dry fuel was becoming increasingly difficult as everything in the forest became contaminated. Day 85 brought my first serious close call with starvation. I hadn't eaten anything substantial since the mountain survivors had stripped me of supplies, and I was starting to feel the effects of malnutrition. My thinking was becoming slower, my coordination was deteriorating, and I was having trouble staying warm even when I was sitting next to the fire. I needed food soon, or I was going to start the downward spiral that ends with people freezing to death in their sleep. I spent that morning looking for anything edible in the immediate area. Pine bark could be chewed for minimal nutrition, and there were a few rose hips still clinging to bushes that hadn't completely died yet. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep my blood sugar stable while I figured out a better solution to the food problem. The better solution came from an unexpected source. While I was searching for edible plants, I found tracks in the ash that didn't belong to wolves or other predators. They were rabbit tracks, and they were fresh. Rabbits were one of the few animals that seemed to be adapting to the ash-covered environment, probably because they were used to living underground and could find food sources that weren't completely contaminated. I spent the next 2 days figuring out how to catch rabbits with no traps, no weapons, and no proper tools. The solution I came up with was primitive but effective. I used stones and sticks to build funnel traps near areas where the tracks were concentrated, then drove the rabbits toward the traps by making noise and movement that spooked them in the right direction. It took me 6 attempts before I caught my first rabbit, but that success taught me more about survival than months of preparation had. I learned that desperation sharpens your focus in ways that comfort never can. When you're truly hungry, you notice things about animal behavior and environmental patterns that you'd never pay attention to under normal circumstances. The rabbit provided enough protein to restore my mental clarity and physical coordination, but it also created new challenges. I had to skin and clean it with improvised tools, then cook it over an open fire without any seasoning or proper cooking equipment. More importantly, I had to preserve what I couldn't eat immediately, which meant smoking the meat over a low fire that I had to maintain constantly. Day 88 brought the psychological crisis I'd been avoiding since losing Cisco and being abandoned by the mountain survivors. The isolation, the constant stress, and the physical deprivation were starting to affect my mental state in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was talking to myself constantly, having conversations with people who weren't there, and making decisions based on paranoid fantasies rather than rational assessment of actual threats. The breaking point came when I spent an entire morning preparing to defend my camp against an attack that I was convinced was coming. I'd heard sounds during the night that I'd interpreted as people approaching through the forest, and I'd worked myself into a state of panic about being discovered by hostile survivors. I spent hours moving between different positions around my shelter, watching for enemies that existed only in my imagination. When I finally accepted that there was no one there, I realized how close I was to complete mental breakdown. The stress of survival was pushing me toward paranoid delusions that could easily get me killed if I started making important decisions based on threats that weren't real. I needed to find ways to maintain my mental health, or the physical survival skills I was developing wouldn't matter. I started talking to Cisco as if he were still alive. I know that sounds crazy, but it gave me a way to think through problems out loud without feeling like I was losing my mind. I'd explain situations to him the way I had when we were working together, talking through the options and asking for his opinion. It was a psychological trick, but it helped me maintain the kind of logical thinking that kept me alive. The rabbit trapping was becoming more successful as I learned to read the signs of where they were feeding and traveling. By day 90, I was catching enough to maintain my basic nutrition, though I was still losing weight steadily. More importantly, the process of hunting was giving me a sense of purpose and accomplishment that helped combat the despair that threatened to overwhelm me during the long, cold nights. But I was also starting to notice changes in the rabbit population that worried me. The animals I was catching were thinner than they should have been, and many of them showed signs of the same respiratory problems that had killed larger animals. The ash was working its way up the food chain, and even the most adaptable species were starting to succumb to long-term exposure. Day 93 brought a discovery that changed my understanding of what was happening in the wider world. While checking my trap lines, I found the remains of a human settlement about 2 miles from my camp. It wasn't recent. The buildings had been burned weeks earlier, and the bodies I found were frozen solid and partially consumed by scavengers. But the evidence told a story about how communities were breaking down. This hadn't been a raider attack like the ones I'd witnessed before. The positioning of the bodies and the way the buildings had been destroyed suggested that the community had turned on itself. Neighbors had fought neighbors, families had split apart, and the settlement had destroyed itself from within. It was a preview of what happened when the stress of survival pushed people beyond their breaking point. I spent the afternoon searching through the ruins for anything useful, and I found several items that significantly improved my situation. A damaged but functional knife, some canned food that had survived the fire, and most importantly, a sleeping bag that was still in usable condition. These weren't just material improvements. They were psychological victories that reminded me that survival was possible even under seemingly impossible conditions. The knife was particularly valuable because it allowed me to process game more efficiently and work with materials in ways that hadn't been possible with improvised stone tools. I could cut branches to specific sizes for shelter construction, skin animals properly, and even defend myself if necessary. It was the first real tool I'd had since being abandoned by the mountain survivors. Day 96 brought my closest call, yet with the predator situation I'd been worried about since the beginning. I was returning to camp from checking traps when I realized I was being followed. Not by wolves this time, but by what looked like a large dog or possibly a wolf-dog hybrid. It was staying about 50 yards behind me, matching my pace but not approaching directly. The animal was obviously hungry and desperate, but it was also showing intelligence that pure wolves didn't usually display. It was evaluating me as potential prey, but it was also being cautious in ways that suggested it had learned to be afraid of humans while still being willing to consider hunting them. This was exactly the kind of predator behavior that emergency preparedness manuals warned about, but that most people never had to face in reality. I made it back to my camp without direct confrontation, but the animal didn't leave. It spent the rest of the day circling my position, testing my reactions and looking for opportunities to get closer. When night fell, I could see its eyes reflecting in my firelight as it moved through the trees, waiting for me to make a mistake or fall asleep at the wrong time. The standoff lasted for 2 days. The animal was patient and intelligent, willing to wait for the right opportunity rather than risk a direct attack against a prepared human. I had to maintain constant vigilance, feeding the fire throughout the night and staying alert for any change in its behavior that might signal an imminent attack. On day 98, the situation resolved itself in an unexpected way. I was preparing my morning meal when I heard sounds of a struggle from the direction where the animal had been hiding. When I investigated cautiously, I found that it had been killed by a pack of wolves that had moved into the area during the night. The wolves had eliminated my immediate threat, but they'd also established themselves as the new dominant predators in the territory around my camp. This was both good news and bad news. The immediate threat from the dog was gone, but wolves were a more serious long-term problem. They were also smarter and more organized than individual predators, and they demonstrated that they were willing to kill other animals that competed with them for hunting territory. I was now living in their domain, and they would eventually test whether I was prey or predator. Day 100 brought a realization that forced me to reconsider my entire survival strategy. I was losing weight steadily despite the protein from rabbit hunting, and my physical condition was deteriorating in ways that couldn't be reversed with the resources available to me. The combination of extreme cold, poor nutrition, and constant stress was pushing my body toward the point where it would start breaking down muscle tissue to maintain basic functions. I calculated that I had maybe 2 weeks before malnutrition became life-threatening, and perhaps a month before I'd be too weak to maintain the fire and shelter that were keeping me alive. I needed to find a better food source, better shelter, or other people who could help me survive the remainder of the winter. Staying in my current situation was a slow but certain death sentence. The decision to leave my camp was one of the hardest I'd made since the beginning of the crisis. The shelter I'd built represented weeks of work and learning, and abandoning it meant giving up the only security I'd managed to create since being cast out by the mountain survivors. But staying meant dying slowly, and leaving at least offered the possibility of finding something better. I spent day 101 preparing for travel. I made a pack from salvaged materials to carry my few possessions, prepared what food I could from my remaining rabbit meat, and planned a route that would take me toward areas where I might find other survivors or abandoned resources. Most importantly, I mentally prepared myself for the possibility that this journey would be my last. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially becoming one of the refugees I'd watched passing by my property in the early days of the crisis. People with no destination, carrying what they could, hoping to find safety or help from strangers who might be just as desperate as they were. The difference was that I had knowledge and skills that most refugees didn't, but I also had no illusions about how difficult the journey would be. Day 102 was my last morning at the camp that had kept me alive for 3 weeks. I extinguished the fire that had been burning continuously since I'd arrived, dismantled the shelter to prevent it from becoming a landmark that might attract unwanted attention, and said goodbye to the place where I'd learned the most important lessons about survival I'd ever encountered. As I walked away from the camp, carrying everything I owned in an improvised pack, and following animal trails through the ash-covered forest, I realized that I was no longer the same person who'd been abandoned by the mountain survivors 3 weeks earlier. The experience of surviving completely alone had changed something fundamental about how I understood my relationship with the world and with other people. I was no longer someone who needed civilization to survive. I'd become someone who could create the tools and knowledge necessary for survival from whatever materials and opportunities were available. It was a hard-won education that had cost me almost everything I'd valued before the crisis, but it was also knowledge that no one could take away from me. The forest was eerily quiet as I made my way toward whatever came next. No birds, no small animals, no sounds of human activity in the distance. Just the crunch of ash under my feet and the whisper of wind through dying trees. It was the sound of a world that was still ending, still changing, still testing everyone and everything that was trying to survive in it. I didn't know what I'd find when I reached the areas I was traveling toward, but I knew that whatever it was, I'd be better prepared to handle it than I'd been at any point since the eruption began. The knowledge I'd gained during my time alone in the forest was the foundation for whatever came next, and for the first time since losing Cisco, I felt genuinely hopeful about my chances of long-term survival. The hardest part of my education was over. Now it was time to find out what I could build with what I'd learned. The first sign that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought came on day 104, when I found footprints in the ash that were too fresh to have been made by the refugees I'd seen weeks earlier. These tracks were recent, maybe 12 hours old, and they belonged to someone who was moving with purpose rather than just wandering. More importantly, whoever had made them was carrying supplies, based on the deeper impressions in the softer ash drifts. I followed the tracks for about 2 miles, staying far enough behind to avoid being detected, but close enough to learn about the person I was trailing. The footprints told a story of someone who knew how to travel efficiently in these conditions, someone who was conserving energy, and following the paths of least resistance through the ash-covered terrain. This wasn't a desperate refugee stumbling through the wilderness. This was someone with experience and knowledge. The tracks led to an abandoned gas station about 5 miles from where I'd made my forest camp. The building had been stripped of anything obviously valuable weeks earlier, but someone had been using it as a temporary shelter recently. I could see evidence of a carefully managed fire inside, and there were signs that whoever had been there had taken time to organize and improve the space rather than just passing through. More importantly, I found something I hadn't seen since the early days of the crisis. A message. Written in charcoal on the wall of the gas station office was a note that said, "Safe route to feed store. Follow road markers, SG." The writing was neat and purposeful, and the information suggested that someone was maintaining communication between survivor groups and tracking resources that were still available. SG had left road markers, and following them became my new priority. The markers were subtle, just arrangements of stones and sticks that would be meaningless to most people, but clearly indicated direction and distance to anyone who knew what to look for. It was a communication system that showed real organization and planning, not the desperate improvisation I'd seen from groups like the Mountain Survivors. Day 106 brought me to the feed store the message had referenced. The building was intact but appeared abandoned, with ash drifts against the doors and no obvious signs of recent activity. But when I examined the area more carefully, I found evidence that people had been there recently and had taken care to conceal their presence. The road markers led directly to a side entrance that was partially hidden by debris. I spent several hours observing the building before approaching, looking for any signs of guards or security measures that might indicate it was occupied or defended. What I found instead were more subtle signs of organization. The debris around the building wasn't random. It had been arranged to provide concealed approaches and defensive positions. Someone had put serious thought into how to use this location safely. The decision to approach the building was one of the most difficult I'd made since leaving my forest camp. Every instinct I'd developed over the past 3 months told me to avoid contact with other people, to assume that anyone I encountered would be a threat to my survival. But I was also running out of options for surviving alone, and the organized nature of what I was seeing suggested these might be people worth the risk of contact. I approached the side entrance during the afternoon, when I'd have maximum visibility and the best chance of retreating if the situation went bad. Instead of trying to enter the building, I positioned myself where I could be seen from inside and waited. If there were people inside, I wanted them to know I was there and give them the opportunity to make contact on their terms rather than surprising them. The wait lasted almost 3 hours, but eventually, a voice called out from inside the building. A woman's voice, cautious but not hostile, asking me to identify myself and explain what I was doing there. I told her my name and that I'd followed the road markers from the gas station, hoping to find other survivors who might be willing to trade information or resources. The conversation that followed was careful and methodical. She asked specific questions about where I'd come from, what I'd seen during my travels, and what skills or resources I might have to offer. I answered honestly, including the fact that I'd been cast out by the Mountain Survivors and had been surviving alone for the past 3 weeks. I also mentioned my background with horses and my knowledge of the local area. After about 20 minutes of questions, she asked me to move to a position where she could see me clearly, then wait while she consulted with others inside the building. I could hear muffled conversations but couldn't make out the words. Eventually, she returned and told me they were willing to let me enter, but that I'd be searched for weapons and that any aggressive behavior would result in immediate expulsion. The woman who met me at the door was in her 40s, with the kind of practical appearance that suggested someone who'd adapted well to the new realities of survival. She introduced herself as Sandra Garrett and explained that she was part of a group of 12 survivors who were working together to establish supply caches and communication networks throughout the region. The initials SG that I'd seen in the message were hers. The feed store had been converted into a combination shelter and distribution center. The group had cleared space for sleeping areas, organized the remaining feed and supplies into manageable inventory, and established workshop areas where they could repair equipment and process food. Most importantly, they'd created a communication center where they tracked information about other survivor groups, available resources, and safe travel routes. Sandra explained that their group operated differently than organizations like the Mountain Survivors. Instead of trying to control territory or dominate other survivors, they focused on creating networks of cooperation and mutual assistance. They maintained several supply caches throughout the region, shared information about safe routes and available resources, and helped coordinate between smaller survivor groups that were struggling on their own. The philosophy behind their approach was simple but revolutionary in the context of post-eruption survival. They believed that cooperation and resource sharing would be more effective for long-term survival than competition and hoarding. Instead of trying to accumulate everything they needed for their own group, they worked to ensure that everyone in their network had access to basic necessities. I spent 3 days with Sandra's group learning about their operation and contributing what knowledge I could about local terrain and resources. They were particularly interested in my information about the mountain survivors, since they'd had reports of raiders operating in the area, but hadn't been able to confirm the size or capabilities of the group. The most impressive aspect of their organization was the communication network they'd established. Using a combination of written messages, road markers, and scheduled meeting points, they maintained contact with survivor groups across a territory that covered several hundred square miles. They knew which areas were controlled by hostile groups, where resources could still be found, and which routes were safe for travel. On day 110, Sandra asked if I'd be willing to take on a specific mission that would use my knowledge of animal husbandry and local geography. One of their allied groups, located about 15 miles to the southeast, was having problems with livestock that were dying from ash exposure. They needed someone with experience in animal care to help them develop strategies for keeping their animals alive through the remainder of the winter. The mission represented exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been hoping to find when I left my forest camp. It would allow me to use skills that I'd developed over 15 years of working with horses and mules, and it would give me a chance to contribute something valuable to a community that seemed to understand the importance of cooperation over competition. More importantly, it would allow me to work with animals again. I hadn't realized how much I missed that part of my life until Sandra described the problems the other group was facing. The knowledge that there were still people trying to keep livestock alive in this harsh environment gave me hope that some aspects of normal life might be recoverable even in the post-eruption world. The journey to the Allied group's location took 2 days, following routes that Sandra's people had mapped as relatively safe for solo travelers. The landscape I traveled through was even more devastated than the areas around my original property. Trees were completely dead, structures had collapsed under ash loads, and there were no signs of surviving wildlife anywhere along the route. But there were also signs that people were adapting and finding ways to survive in conditions that should have been impossible. I passed several locations where survivors had created shelters using techniques I'd never seen before, combining traditional construction methods with innovations that addressed the specific challenges of ash contamination and extreme cold. Day 112 brought me to the community Sandra had described, and I immediately understood why they needed help with their livestock situation. They'd managed to keep about 20 cattle and a dozen horses alive, but the animals were in terrible condition. They were losing weight rapidly, showing respiratory symptoms, and displaying the kind of behavioral problems that indicated severe stress. The community leader was a man named Robert Chen, and he'd been a veterinarian before the eruption. He understood animal health better than most people, but he was dealing with conditions that no veterinary training had prepared him for. The volcanic ash was creating health problems that couldn't be treated with conventional medicine, and he was struggling to adapt his knowledge to completely unprecedented circumstances. I spent the first day with Robert's group assessing the condition of their animals and trying to understand what approaches they'd already tried. They'd experimented with different types of shelter, various feeding strategies, and even improvised respiratory treatments, but nothing was preventing the gradual deterioration that was affecting all their livestock. The solution I proposed was based on techniques I'd learned during my time with Mrs. Patterson and my experience caring for animals in the immediate aftermath of the eruption. Instead of trying to treat the symptoms of ash exposure, we needed to prevent exposure entirely. That meant creating completely enclosed environments where the animals could breathe clean air and eat uncontaminated food. The project required the entire community to work together for almost a week, but we managed to create sealed shelters using salvaged materials and techniques that minimized ash infiltration. We also developed systems for processing feed to remove contamination and providing clean water that wasn't affected by ash runoff. The results were dramatic and immediate. Within 3 days of moving the animals to the improved shelters, their respiratory symptoms began to improve. Within a week, they were eating more regularly and showing signs of weight gain. Most importantly, they were displaying normal behaviors again instead of the stress responses that had been dominating their interactions. Day 119 brought news that changed my understanding of the wider situation beyond our immediate survival concerns. Robert had maintained a shortwave radio, and he'd been monitoring emergency broadcasts from government agencies and other organizations that were still functioning in unaffected areas. What he'd learned was both encouraging and terrifying. The ash cloud from the Yellowstone eruption was beginning to dissipate in some areas, particularly along the coasts where ocean winds were clearing the atmosphere more quickly than in the interior regions. Temperatures were starting to stabilize, though they remained well below normal for the season. Most importantly, there were indications that the worst effects of the volcanic winter might last months rather than years. But the social collapse that had followed the eruption was continuing even in areas where the environmental conditions were improving. Communities that had survived the immediate crisis were still breaking apart due to resource conflicts and leadership failures. The kind of cooperative approach that Sandra's network was using was rare, and most survivor groups were still operating under assumptions that made long-term recovery more difficult. Robert's community decided to formalize their alliance with Sandra's network and commit to the cooperative model for resource sharing and mutual assistance. They had livestock and agricultural knowledge that other groups needed, and Sandra's people had communication systems and geographic knowledge that could help Robert's group connect with other communities that were trying to rebuild rather than just survive. I was asked to serve as a liaison between the two groups, using my mobility and knowledge of the local area to maintain communication and coordinate resource sharing. It was exactly the kind of role I'd hoped to find when I left my forest camp, combining my practical skills with the opportunity to help build something better than what had existed before the crisis. Day 123 brought my first real test in the liaison role. Sandra's group had received reports of a third survivor community that was interested in joining their network, but the community was located in territory that was controlled by the mountain survivors. Someone needed to make contact and assess whether cooperation was possible without triggering conflict with Hawkins and his raiders. I volunteered for the mission, partly because I knew the mountain survivors' capabilities and tactics better than anyone else in the network, and partly because I had personal reasons for wanting to see how their situation had developed since they'd cast me out. The journey would take me through territory I'd lived and worked in for 15 years, and it would allow me to see what had happened to my original property. The trip to my old property was emotionally difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. The landscape was completely transformed by months of ash accumulation and the complete absence of any living vegetation. Places that had been familiar landmarks were unrecognizable, and the silence was absolute in areas that should have been full of wildlife activity. My barn was still standing, but it was clear that the mountain survivors had abandoned the property weeks earlier. The building was empty except for ash drifts, and there were no signs of recent human activity. Most importantly, there were no signs of what had happened to the animals they'd taken from me when they'd driven me out. I found evidence of their departure in the area around the house. Vehicle tracks, discarded equipment, and the remains of temporary shelters suggested they'd left in a hurry rather than as part of a planned relocation. There were also signs of conflict, including bullet holes in some of the buildings and areas where the ground had been disturbed by digging that might have been graves. The third community I'd been sent to contact was located about 8 miles from my old property, in an area that had been ranch land before the eruption. They'd managed to establish themselves in a complex of farm buildings that provided good defensive positions and space for the 23 people who made up their group. Unlike the mountain survivors, they'd focused on agriculture and animal husbandry rather than raiding. The community leader was a woman named Maria Santos, who'd been a high school principal before the eruption and had applied organizational skills from education to the challenges of survival leadership. Her group had managed to keep a small herd of goats alive, and they'd been experimenting with growing food in enclosed spaces where they could control contamination from ash. Maria's group was interested in joining Sandra's network, but they were concerned about the security implications of cooperating with other communities. They'd had several encounters with raider groups, including at least one confrontation with people who matched the description of the mountain survivors. They wanted assurance that joining a cooperative network wouldn't make them more vulnerable to attack. I spent 2 days with Maria's community, sharing information about the network's security practices and learning about their innovations in ash-resistant agriculture. They developed techniques for growing food that could potentially feed much larger populations than most survivor groups were managing to support. But they needed access to seeds and equipment that they couldn't obtain on their own. The negotiation process was complicated by news that arrived on day 126. A messenger from Sandra's group brought word that the mountain survivors had attacked one of the network's supply caches, killing 2 people and destroying resources that several communities had been depending on. Hawkins and his raiders were apparently expanding their territory and becoming more aggressive about eliminating potential competition. This news forced all of us to reconsider the security situation and the risks associated with cooperation between survivor groups. Maria's concerns about vulnerability were clearly justified, and Sandra's network was going to have to develop better defensive capabilities if they wanted to continue operating in the same region as hostile groups like the mountain survivors. The solution we developed was based on the same principles of cooperation and resource sharing that had made the network successful in other areas. Instead of trying to defend individual communities against raiders, we would coordinate defensive efforts across multiple locations and share intelligence about threats. Communities that were attacked could call for assistance from other network members, and raider groups would face coordinated resistance rather than isolated targets. Day 127 brought me back to the present moment, sitting in this abandoned house in Greeley where I've been telling you this story. The journey from Maria's community took me through areas that showed both the devastation of the past 4 months and the early signs of recovery that are beginning to appear in some locations. The network that Sandra's group established has grown to include 7 communities with a total population of over 150 people. We've developed systems for sharing resources, coordinating defense, and maintaining communication across a territory that covers several hundred square miles. Most importantly, we've proven that cooperation and mutual assistance are more effective survival strategies than competition and hoarding. The mountain survivors are still operating in this region, but their influence has diminished as more communities have joined the cooperative network. Hawkins' group is finding it increasingly difficult to raid isolated targets, and they're facing organized resistance when they do attempt attacks. The model of survival through dominance and exploitation is proving less sustainable than the model based on cooperation and resource sharing. The environmental situation is slowly improving in some areas. The ash is beginning to settle and compact, making travel easier and reducing the respiratory problems that have killed so many animals and people. Temperatures are still well below normal, but they're no longer dropping consistently, and there are even occasional days when the sun is visible through the ash clouds. But the most important change isn't environmental or organizational. It's psychological. People are beginning to think about rebuilding rather than just surviving. Communities like Maria's are experimenting with agriculture and planning for long-term sustainability. Sandra's network is developing educational programs to share survival knowledge and technical skills. Robert's group is working on breeding programs to restore livestock populations. We're still living day to day, still facing constant challenges from weather, predators, and hostile human groups. Every morning brings new problems that have to be solved with limited resources and improvised solutions. But we're also building something that might last beyond the immediate crisis. Something that might become the foundation for whatever kind of civilization emerges from this catastrophe. The skills I learned during those weeks alone in the forest, the knowledge I gained from working with different communities, and the connections I've made through Sandra's network have given me a role in that rebuilding process. I'm no longer just trying to survive until things get better. I'm helping to create the conditions that will make things better for everyone who's managed to survive this far. That's what I've learned from these 127 days since Yellowstone erupted and changed everything. Survival isn't just about staying alive through the immediate crisis. It's about adapting to permanent changes and building new systems that work better than the old ones. It's about choosing cooperation over competition, even when competition seems like the safer choice. Most importantly, it's about understanding that the end of one world can be the beginning of something better if you're willing to do the work to make it happen. The story isn't over. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new choices about what kind of world we want to rebuild from the ashes of the old one. But for the first time since that Tuesday morning when the emergency alerts started buzzing on my phone, I'm genuinely optimistic about what comes next. We've learned how to survive. Now we're learning how to live.